right, so before I get started, if anything, I was uploading the slides, and my Amazon S3 server didn't really work out with them, but after the video has been recorded, the slides will be on this link below, but for now, we'll just have to view the slides off my screen. So I'm here to talk about Angular in the context of just jumping into it right away without, having to spend the time talking about, this is what a directive is, this is what this is, until, it's been hours and then you haven't built anything. So this is the approach that me and Matthew thought would be best, because it would be nice if it was, but it isn't. So Angular extends the capabilities of HTML. And as we'll see soon, we're going to see modular JavaScript code. And there's a beautiful system called dependency injection. If anyone here is familiar with Java Spring or any DI-based framework, and you've used it for a long time and you see the benefits compared to just standard object-oriented programming with just instantiating objects and chaining dependencies together, you'll notice you really like that sort of paradigm of coding. And controllers and URL routing, so you can use the hashbang, you can use HTML5 history to render views on your AngularJS application. And scoping, as we saw, where we put a value on the scope, which is the memory of the application, we put name, and the name can be referenced in the application, and then animation hooks. So what me and Matthew planned for today's meetup is we wanted to make a TTC Angular application that would just display the nearest subways and would show you, if you want to look up a particular subway station, when the next subway is coming. And there's an unofficial API called myttc.ca. And thankfully, they didn't have a API key. So I'm not sure if too many people connect what would happen. But so with this whole setup in mind, we didn't have any backend. So there's no, Node isn't running, no PHP, no Ruby, none of that stuff. It's 100% static, which means
Twitter and the password. Just grab the one that's close to you. The one by the window by Matias is actually the 7474. The one by the kitchen is 7478, and the other one is the other one, by the door way over where everybody came in.
So that link right there to the demo is like the live demo of what we're going to get in the end. But then the commands below to clone and to run npm install, that's what you'll install to get this website to work. Okay. Well, this is the demo app once again. It's not the GitHub one. Yeah. The other one then. GitHub one's much longer, but. Now, for anyone using Windows here, I did not test this out on Windows. I apologize. I have a Surface at home, but I just didn't get around to it today. It was a very long day today. So when you clone the repo, by default, it's going to the master branch, which has the final updated version of the website, but the get started branch has parts that are taken out, which I'm going to be filling in this talk. And I didn't want to deal with Bower, so it's just a matter of npm install. Okay, so I'm going to continue now. Basically, with this application, where do we start? So we're going to be pulling in data from myttc.ca. And let's figure out a way how to pull that data into our application and display it. So getting started right away, we have an application that's already here. Let's take a look at that. Here's what the application looks like. Basically, we have an app folder, which has all of our application code, a build folder, which will contain our final packaged website, and a node modules website, which is installed by npm. So hopping into app, the directory structure is a little bit different than what you would see with like a tutorial online about AngularJS. This is the best practiced way of doing it, where you basically place all of your JavaScript and CSS files as files in the folder. So there's no scripts, there's no styles folder. And the reason for this is that if you were to copy a subpart of this application, there's no paths that are crisscrossing. So in this case, we have a home directory, we have a stations directory, and then we have our CSS and JavaScript files. And if we look at our index.html file, you'll see that we've referenced them in here. So I did say I didn't want to deal with Bower, but the Bower components are inside of the GitHub repo, so you don't have to run Bower. So we're using jQuery and underscore and URI router and all that stuff. But here we have the JavaScript files that we're going to be referencing into our application. And for each area of the application, each view, I like to have a different JavaScript file. And I like to have the HTML file, which is associated with that view, in the same directory. So if you look in home, we have home.html, and we have home.js, and we have a file called nearme.html and nearme.js. Okay, so let's actually see what this looks like. So this is kind of what we want. We want to have a system which is going to query the TTC API, and we want to be able to find all the subway stations that are associated with, you know, the Young line, the Shepherd line, the Bloor line. Now, the API was kind of strange. It didn't have a listing of all the subway stations by default, so I had to collect all these and put these into a JSON file. But it actually has data for each one. Sorry, there's audio. Sorry, there's audio issues. So. Oh, it's not on yet. Okay, there we go. This is much better. Okay, so back to our TTC website, you'll see that we have a listing of all the subway stations, right? And if we type in a search here, we type in like Finch, you can see that it filtered out Finch. But it also filtered out the Shepherd and the Bloor lines. If I click on Finch, I have to open this in an incognito window. HTTPS doesn't really work well with Amazon. So here we have a listing for Finch Station. And we have all of the bus stops, and then we have the actual subway platform. If we click on a subway stop, we can see that we're going to be jumping from one bus stop to another. And we click on the subway stop, you can see at the bottom. If you look into the actual data for each stop, you'll see that we have a listing of each of the duration, or the next times the subway is going to be taking a trip. So, you know, Finch West is going to be in 1 minute, basically. And if we go to near me, we can see the subway stations that are close by where we are right now. So that's asking me if I want to enable my geolocation. I click allow, and now these are all the subway bus stops that are close by. And this is what we're going to learn how to do today. So if I click here on Albert and Bay, these are the bus stops that are close by and when the next bus is coming. So if anybody's going towards DuPont, then you have about 5 minutes to catch your bus. But it also shows the next ones as well. And once you start playing around with Angular, you're going to want to play around with a lot of APIs to be pulling in data into your application. So let's get started with the get started branch. So I'm going to go git checkout get started. Okay. So now I'm going to run the command gulp. And gulp is going to turn on the website. And now I can access this website. Whoops. What's going? Oh, it's already on. My mistake. So if I go to 8080, you can see that we only have one of the subway data streams coming in. So we're going to write the HTML code or write the JavaScript code to get this to work. So there's a file called ttc-library.js, which comes with these functions that Angular uses. They're called factories, which are reusable functions, reusable blocks of code that you can use in your application. And we have the TTC stations, which will return a series of stations for a particular line, young line or bloor line or shepherd line. And you know how on the bloor line there's that line past Scarborough that's like a different color, but I don't know what it's called, so I just put it into the bloor line. So. Pardon me? Right. So it's on the same line, so Anyways, so there's 3 of them, and when you figure out which subway stop you want to look up, you're going to put that into the TTC station, and that's going to return the data for that particular station. And then finally, as we saw with the nearby, we pass it a latitude and longitude, and it tells us everything that's close by. So how do you actually query JSON data from a server? There's really 2 common ways to do this. You can use JSONP, which is almost guaranteed to work. But JSONP, does everyone know what JSONP is? Does anyone not know what it is? Okay, so does everyone know what a JSON request to a server is? So it's kind of like, it's like XML JSON, but it's in JavaScript notation. So you're like, give me data, and it's going to give you back an array of data through HTTP. But JSONP is that, but you provided a callback function. And the callback function will execute it. But the difference is, instead of executing in the context of XHR, like the standard HTTP function that queries data from a remote resource without the page reloading, it's putting it into a script tag. And the script tag is running on your website. And for that to work, the server has to accept a callback parameter. And this is what JSONP is, and it's a nice way to download data from other servers. But nowadays, there's something called CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing. And if a server supports it, it adds these headers into the output of the HTML that tell the browser that, hey, you're allowed to download HTML, or you're allowed to download data from the server. So let's take a look at the GitHub API. Sorry. Okay, let's go to the. This microphone keeps falling. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay, that's better. So, let's go to GitHub's API. And let's look at an example request, right? Let's, this one right here. If you notice that when I type this in, it gives me output, but do you see these particular headers? Access control. If your server returns these, then another domain, another website, code from another website can download the data from this particular URL. And this allows for other websites to service extract data from other websites in their JSON API. So with that sort of in place, you don't have to use JSONP. And Since we're pulling in data from a JSON resource, we don't have anything in the template. We're not going to be having any sort of subway stuff in the template. All the data is pulled in from the server and pasted into the template. So this is our function that's going to be querying the TTC server. Let's talk about what's going here. So we're injecting HTTP, and by injecting it means like I need the HTTP instance to query the server, and it gives you an instance of that. I need the queue function, which is for promises, and I need the API, like a constant value for the API prefix, which is HTTP my ttc.ca/API, and this one is the suffix, which is the callback. Since the TTC website doesn't support cores, we have to use JSONP, as you can see here. And basically what's happening here is that we build the path. So we're going to take the path, we're going to put the HTTP and then put the suffix on there. And then we're going to query the JSONP server, and the success method is going to call. And when that calls, we're going to call our promise. And basically what a promise is it's a reusable, or portable callback that you can pass around to other parts of the application. And then you can register multiple functions that will be triggered when the callback is resolved. And Angular does this behind the scenes with this defer function right here. So we're creating a promise. We're saying, here is the promise that once it's fulfilled, then we have the HTTP data. And we're returning that promise. And then when the actual HTTP data is done, we get back the defer is called. So let's take a look at the app file. So let's talk about this first before we look at the app file. So that was the service that's going to download stuff from the myTTC API. And we're going to use TTC stations to download that. And now we're going to use ngRepeat to display that data on the screen. So here's what our home controller looks like. And a controller in Angular is basically a block of code that manages logic for a page. So for example, if you click on a button on the page and it prints a message, that's logic. That's not necessarily DOM, because the DOM is responsible for injecting the element into the page or showing and hiding something. Basically, if websites didn't have the DOM, the logic would be there. The logic is what happens in the controller. So what's happening here? We're going to TTC stations, we're getting the young line, and then when the promise is fulfilled, when the data has been downloaded, we're going to call this callback function, which gives us our stations, and then we're going to attach it to the scope. And the scope is the memory of the page. Whatever you put on the scope can be displayed in the page. So we're doing that with the shepherd line. We're doing that with the blur line. And now let's copy this code right here, and let's paste this here. So we have the young, shepherd, and blur line code. And then if you look above right here, this is the route that we're going to configure to the home page. So when you go to /, it's going to load the home controller. It's going to load the home page.html, or home.html, and we're going to give this state the name of home. This isn't the standard routing that Angular comes with. It's called UI router. And I just chose this here because if we have enough time, we're going to put this into an Ionic application, which will render it as a mobile app. So this is the HTML code to display the subway station. So we already seen the young subway line stations, right? And what we're doing here is we're repeating over the stations instead of young line stations. And since young line stations was put on the scope, that means it's put on the memory of the application, which means that it can be read in the template. We're iterating over all the stations, and we're aliasing them as stations. So if there's any PHP developers here, there's the for each, right? And the for each, you're aliasing each item in the loop as a variable. That's what's happening here. We're aliasing station is the current station in the loop. And yes, that does exist in Java, Ruby, and JavaScript, and I don't know. I'm going to jump between programming languages for this talk. All right, so we are rendering a link in the template to show a station, and the station comes with an ID, and the ID is going to be Finch Station or Blur Station or whatever, and then we have a title, which is the proper presented title for that station. So we go into our template code. So if you see here, it says home.html. So we go to app, home.html. Here we have that code. But if we want to get this code to work for the shepherd line, we're just going to copy this, paste this here, and we're going to copy this and paste this here. But instead of referencing young line stations, we're going to enter blur line stations. And then here we're going to reference shepherd line stations. Now if you render the page, right, that's the wrong file. Here we have it. You can see that the young line, the shepherd line, the blur line is showing up. But what's happening in the HTML? So far we don't have that many lines of code. We don't have hundreds of stations showing up. So when Angular sees this, it's going to take the scope data, the array of values in the stations. It's going to clone this div element as many times as there are on the page. And it's going to render it based on all the data for what the station is equal to. So if station is equal to Finch, North York Station, and so on, right? We look at the HTML code. So we go to home.html. We view the file directly. You can see that it's just a template, so there's no data. But when Angular sees that template, it renders it. So if we actually look at the DOM in the page, you can see that that ng repeat thing that we defined is being cloned and copied that many times, over and over again. So let's do the next task. So websites like to have filtering capabilities where you can type in a value and then the result set is diminished. And as you can see here, we have a filtering input field where we would type something in, but it's not working right now. So how do we get this to work? Basically, a filter will take that repeater and filter out all the values before they're actually passed to the repeating part. So if we pass in a filter, we type in search, this filter is going to be called, and then the search, which is the criteria for the filter, is going to be applied. But how do we define what search is? Up here, we have something called an ng model. An ng model is a two-way data binding. That means that whatever you put into the data binding will get displayed on the page, but when the data binding is changed elsewhere, then it'll update in the input field. So now, if I refresh and I start typing in Finch, you can see the young line updates, but not the other ones. So we need to add the filter search to each of them. So now if I start typing in Finch, it only shows up on the young line. The other ones get filtered out. So once again, this ng model code that we had before is what is setting the criteria for search. And that variable is getting passed into the filter part. So let's hop into the station page. Let's make it so that if you click on a particular station in that list, it will go to its own page, which will display its own details for the stops and the routes and the destination times. So the main thing we need to do is before actually loading the template, we need to download the station data from the API beforehand, before the controller is run, because the controller cannot work without it. And then we need to list the data on the page. So here's our route definition for the station. And now you'll see that all the other stuff we had before is very similar. However, we're using a different syntax for the controller. We're doing controller as. And you can alias the actual instance of the controller as a variable. And you can interact with it in a different way. There's various benefits of doing this. Not all your data is placed on the scope. It's placed in the context of this variable. And you can reuse it easier in other parts of your application. The station.html file is stored in the predictable stations directory. And now we have this resolve action. So what's happening here? Basically, we're saying that before the controller is run, it's going to expect to have a station variable. And what is a station variable? Well, the station variable is going to be the data for the station downloaded from the API. So since we have the handy ttc station function, see how we included it in here in the function parameters? So the ttc station, when you give it a station name like Finch or Blur, it's going to download that. Sorry. But it doesn't give the data right away because it's not there right away because it's an asynchronous thing. It returns a promise. So this resolver knows that when the promise is fulfilled, it's going to render the controller. So the state params is the data in the URL. So you see here how we have URL station station. So this station parameter is the value that shows up in the URL. So it'll be station/Finch or station/
Glencairn, or I don't know many of the other ones outside of the Young subway line. So this is all the code that we need to figure out the dependency beforehand. So if we look in the actual controller, see how we have the station variable in here getting passed into the controller? It's like here, the controller's starting, here's your station. And that way we don't have to do any of the downloading inside of the controller code. We're setting the station name to this. We're not using scope here. We're setting it on top of the controller. And you'll see how that works in a minute. But in addition, we're filtering through all of the stops, and we have this function called isValidStop. So the API might give some invalid stops that maybe out of service or just don't have any particular routes. There were some old outdated data in that API. So this underscore filter is a feature of underscore. So we're basically saying that for all the stops, if it is a valid stop, add it into the array. And then in addition, for the subway stops, we have an isSubwayStop. So there's a particular way to detect if it's a subway stop, if it has platform in the name of the stop. And then a bus stop, which is reject is the opposite of filter. If it is not a subway stop, then it's considered a bus stop. So these are our functions to determine if it is a subway stop or if it isn't. So you see here how we're attaching everything to the views module. So the views module has all of our views, and it has the controllers and the routing and so on. And if it is a subway stop, it has platform. If it is a valid stop, and then we're going to filter through all the routes for each stop, and we're going to display the route name, and then we're going to filter through all the stop times for each of the routes. So it's 3 separate repeaters within each other. But this is the way that the API data has been put together. So we're displaying the shape, and the shape basically means, if we look at the final version, the shape basically means where it's going, like the name of the bus route or whatever. And then here we have the departure time, the timestamp. So we're using the time HTML element, where we can just pass in date time directly. So it's more semantic. So the screen reader can read this. And then here we have an expression to actually display the time. So this right here, the only reason we need it is because JavaScript deals with timestamps in milliseconds, not in seconds like some backend technologies. And so we're going to multiply the timestamp by 1,000 to get the milliseconds. And then we're going to format the output as a date. Now this medium date value is the medium time. That's an alias time that Angular provides, but you can pass in like the minutes, seconds, hours, and AM and PM, and the day of the week if you want to. Obviously for a TTC subway map, there's no point in displaying what day of the week it's going to be, because they're all going to be on the same day. Unless when it's 4 a.m. and you're writing this, and then you see that the next subway time is at 6 a.m. But that's the only time that it'll change. So the medium time does a good job of displaying the only time that you need. So that's why we have the 7, 32, 42. So even this doesn't really make sense, having the seconds in there, unless you're in a really big hurry and you want to catch the subway. But the PM, I guess, would make sense. Now, what would be cool if we could make it if it would tell you how much time you have left. So you see this counter slowly going upwards, and then you have like 5 minutes to catch this train, 10 minutes to catch the next train. So let's copy this code into our station.html file. And now that, yeah.
Could you get the projector to move up and to your right so that we can see what you're typing?
I'm not control the projector, can you?
I think can you change the window size just slightly up a bit to the bottom?
You mean move the window up?
Yeah, like the physical window. Like you're talking with the bottom, right?
Yeah, the bottom and this side.
And that side?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a matter of getting up on a giant ladder. Is it possible for you to change the window size a little bit?
Yeah, just let me know what works. Is this better or worse?
Better.
Okay.
Yeah, take a look at your right.
I think that's a little better right there. Okay.
Projector. It's attached. I think, yeah, don't need that. There you go.
Okay. So let's talk about the geolocation part. How does this work? So
in order, like, you want to reuse as many frameworks and components as you can. So I found a geolocation tool for Angular from Bower, and I put that into the application. And that made me get the TTC nearby function to play around with the data that's put into the latitude and the longitude. And we're going to place that data into a controller in the template. So let's go into the TTC library file. And here we have the TTC nearby function. And basically, like, this stuff is a little bit more advanced Angular stuff, but we're calling TTC request with a specific path. So that means that for the specific path, we're passing in a latitude and longitude. Let's take a look at the URL for that. So you see here I have an expression with lat and expression with long. So if I pass that into the API, it's going to give me the data that comes back. So the latitude and longitude is what I get from the geolocation. And this interpolate, so anything with $1 is a service that Angular provides. It's a reusable function that Angular provides. So in addition to being built on top of all these services as a framework, it allows you to use them yourself. So you save a lot of code. You don't have to reinvent code that's already in the framework. And this interpolate thing basically does what we see in the template. There's a binding, and then you give it a value, and then it prints the value into the page. So we're going to give it that URL, this TTC lat long path. And then we're going to pass in the latitude and longitude as variables. And we're going to get a path back, and then we're going to do a request. And once again, we're returning the request, which is a promise. So we can determine what code is run after when we return the promise. Let's take a look at the geolocation part. So the geolocation part is we have the geolocation service. See how we included the geolocation service? And then we tell it to get the location. Then when the location has been determined, when the user has clicked on the button and it gives you the latitude and longitude, we get these latitude and longitude values. And then we pass these into our TTC nearby, and then after that we get the results. And this code is here just to prevent it so that if a null value is returned, we're going to give it an empty array. So we're passing it again onto the scope, and the scope is what the template's attached to. Then for the controller that manages that page, we're going to call this file nearme.html. And we're going to call it nearme controller, and the URL is going to be /nearme. So this is what the HTML code looks like once again to display all the stations nearby. So this code is very similar to what we saw before. And when you click on the location, it's going to go to this address. So one thing you'll notice is that we keep seeing ng dash. What does that mean? Those are Angular's HTML components. So what these components are, they're called directives. So they basically extend HTML. So obviously, you can't repeat stuff in HTML, right? So there's this component called ngRepeat, which does that. Oh, my slides ended early because there's a lot of other things I want to talk about. So, oh, whoops. Let me close that back. OK. So let's go back into our application. So if we go to near me, it doesn't work, right? So nothing's going on there. And this is kind of what was left with the get started thing to kind of figure this out on your own. I'm going to copy this from my master branch. And there's our HTML code. So you'll notice that there's a loading thing. And when we set loading to true, it's going to show the loading message. And then when we have all the data, it's going to show the data on this page. So you see here how we have ngIf. Basically, if loading is true, show this div element. And then here we have if loading is not true, then show this part. So if we refresh the page, you can see loading there for just a second. But if we actually remove it from the JavaScript code, so let's say that we do a return right here, you'll see that it's loading for the whole time, right? So loading gets set to false when the data has been downloaded, loading set to true when the controller is instantiated. And then when we click on it, it brings us back to our page. It displays this. So let's cover two other things. Let's cover a quick intro to these animations on this page so we can animate the results right here. And then let's look at how we can package this application together. And then let's take a look at, if we have some time, how we can put this into a mobile application with Ionic. Okay, so our filtering so far, it works like we type in values right here, but this is very fast. We can't really see the value getting taken out of the page, right? Because it's taken out of the DOM right away. And there's a module in Angular called ngAnimate, which allows you to put animation hooks into these construction and deconstruction points in your application, so that we saw with the loading message when it was taken out of the page and put into the page, that's an enter and that's a leave animation, or leave and enter in the order I set it. And then with the elements that are rendered in that list, it's a leave and move operation as well, or leave and enter. But for example, if I type in N right here, you'll see that North York, instead of being second in the list, it goes to the first page. So that's a move animation. So these are all examples of animations in Angular. Okay, so how can we make each of these elements right here animate as they're getting put into the page? So the first thing let's do, let's go here and let's add ngAnimate as a module. And then in the HTML page right here, let's add, AngularAnimate is here in the HTML, which is good. So now we have ngAnimate. Okay, so what else do we have to do? Now the animations are active on our application. Let's go into that listing page. So we go to app home, home.html. And let's say for the young line, we want to animate these. So we're going to pass in the class, we're going to call this one fade. And now, if we go into our ttc app.css file, we're going to pass in a fade, and we're going to set, transition 0.5 linear all. That's all we're going to do. So what happens now? If I type in Finch, you can see there's a little gap in there. So the animation is running, but nothing's actually happening. So let's start off by having an enter animation. So we'll say ng enter, and we're going to start by having an opacity of 0. And then we're going to go from ng enter active, which is this enter is the starting animation, what it starts out with, and the active is what it's going to animate towards. So we want to go from something that's invisible to something that is visible, so opacity 0 to opacity 1. So now when I type in Finch, you can see that they kind of fade into the page, right? But we don't have a leave animation, so let's copy this, and let's put leave, and let's flip the animation styles, because obviously enter is the opposite of leave. So now if I start typing in values, you can see that they fade in and fade out. But look, on this side of the screen, nothing's happening on that side. So Bayview, you can see those disappear, but the ones on the left appear right away. So we can reuse the class fade, and we can just add it to each of the repeaters. So now if I start typing in Finch, you can see that happens. But this is not very noticeable because they all fade in at the same time. So how can we add a little bit of a better animation to make it aware that new data is coming to the page? So let's add a stagger to this. And a stagger is an animation that provides a space in between the next animation. So you see this little gap. It's kind of like a curtain effect. And we're going to do transition delay 0.5 or 0.1 second. And this is a requirement. You have to put in transition duration 0, because this will get inherited into this by CSS, and you don't want to put the, and like ngAnimate has a fallback so that if it wasn't there, everything would stagger. So now if we actually type in values, you can see that like these results sort of animate in this cool way. And like, maybe 100 milliseconds is too much, so let's pass in 0.02. Now we type in Finch, you can see that you get these cool animations. And now let's change this up. In addition to fade, let's pass in another class right here. It's called a slide from left. And let's say for ng enter, so anything that's slide from left, we're going to pass in position relative. And slide from left, ng enter, we're going to pass in a left thing of negative 50 pixels, where it starts off with. And then what it's going towards, we're going to pass in 0, so it's sliding in from the left side of the screen to the right. And then the leave animation is going to be the opposite. And now we're going to add the CSS class. Let's add it to the Finch line. So we say slide from left, and hopefully this works. So Finch, you can kind of see. Let's extend the gap so we can play around with this. So let's put this back to 1. Let's see what happens now. You can see this cool effect. And now for the near me, if we want to show the loading animation, and the loading animation will disappear when the actual page is there, let's go into the near me, and let's pass in fade right here. So class fade. And this one I have a class fade. So you can see that when you get the data, it just fades it in. So all this animation code has nothing to do with the template, aside from the CSS class. It has nothing in JavaScript. You can make JavaScript animations if you want in a different mechanism. All of it's in CSS. So ngAnimate's smart enough to sort of link the template's destruction and construction mechanisms into the animation. And then, if you wanted to have it so that this area, this whole screen, were to animate from left to right, let's say that we go into our index.file, we go to app index, and we go to our view file. So we have this UI view, which is where the page changes, basically. If there's any Ruby developers, that's the yield thing in Ruby Rails. So if I pass in fade right here, you can see that the page fades in from page to page. So I go to this other page, you can see. So just by spending 5 minutes playing with CSS code, we added animations across the entire application. Okay, so the next thing let's do, so you want to put this website up online. How do you do that? Well, basically you want to build the application so that the CSS code and the JavaScript code is compressed together and minified, and it's one file, and the file has a name that's sort of like a version of the file, right? So if it's the same file name, then it could be cached across servers. So if I type in the command gulp build, this basically combines everything into the files that we need, and it makes it into a folder called build. So if I look in the build folder, I can't make this, unfortunately I can't make the font size here bigger. So we have an assets file, and the assets file has all the compressed HTML together, compressed CSS, and some other files that I had from before. Our components got copied, but we didn't copy any of the JavaScript files in the application. All that we copied were the HTML files. So the code to actually get this to work with gulp was actually surprisingly small. This code right here gets the web server to run. And we have a command for default that would launch the web server. When I typed in gulp, it launched the web server. But when I typed in gulp build, it's going to copy the HTML files over, and then it's going to call useman. So the copy HTML files, it's looking for anything that has HTML in the app directory, as well as the JSON file, and then and not the index file. It's going to copy all those over as they are into the build folder, and then the useman's going to run. And basically, it's going to process on the index file. It's going to find all of the link elements and all of the script elements, and it's going to combine them into single files. And then it's going to minify them, it's going to concatenate them, and then it's going to revision them so that they have, see how it has the dash. So I copy the file name right here. See how it has the revision name in there, the short little watermark for the contents of the file and then the date that it was created. So when that's uploaded to a server, the website's going to have the new file, and it's going to know to download that. And then the same thing for JavaScript. It's going to uglify, which is the same thing as minification, just a specific program called uglify. And it's going to revision that, and then it's going to pipe it and put everything into build. So if anybody here has done grunt work before, not grunt work, but work with grunt before, and I'm not saying that grunt work is grunt work. So if anyone's done grunt, like stuff with grunt before, you notice that the style is very different. The sort of the API, the code that you have to do to get these same tasks is much longer, but it's just a different mechanism. It's kind of like make with C code back in the day. Gulp is a little bit different. It uses pipes and streams to kind of take the output of one command and put it into another command. And this dest file is going to take all of the files that are collected here and put them into the build directory. So these two commands, useman and copy HTML files, basically copied over the entire website into the build folder. And we don't have any JavaScript stuff in here. The Bower components, like this is a tiny bug in this application. I need to not copy these files over. But otherwise, we didn't copy any CSS JavaScript files. All we have is the combined ones. And if I copy this build folder and put it up on a web server, it just works. It's going to connect to the API. So this is the isolation that I mean by having your front-end code completely isolated from your back-end code. This is the way to write web applications in the future. The back-end has nothing to do with the front-end anymore. And all it is just JSON data getting passed back and forth. The big benefit to doing this is that if I were to copy this folder and put it into Amazon S3 in CloudFront, CloudFront's a proxy cache, that website's going to get copied around the world. And if you have your www pointing to the CloudFront address, then anyone who accesses it will be instantly fast from pretty much anywhere in the world because it's going to find the closest proxy server to render the website. But then the backend, which is the JSON API, is going to be on a particular server. But instead of having to scale the front end, people are requesting an image all the time, that's out of your hands. That's done by a CDN now. The backend code is what's going to manage the actual data for the website. So now that we have this build folder, let's actually get this to work in Ionic. Hopefully I can get this to work. So, okay, so if you go to Ionic's website, so Ionic is an option for building a mobile application with Angular and HTML. So we're going to run these commands right here. And if you want to install this on your own, you're going to have to run npm install a bunch of times. So you're going to have to install Cordova and Ionic. So Cordova is what PhoneGap uses. So a lot of these HTML5 native applications done with HTML they fall back to Cordova, which is how PhoneGap works and so on. So let's create a new application. Let's call this one IonicDart. Okay, I can't move that up. So Ionic, oops, there we go. So IonicDart, and we're going to call this TTC app. And now it's just downloading the Ionic template, which is the sort of default application for Ionic. So now we go to the TTC app, and we have a www folder, right? So let's actually go to that www folder, and let's hop in there. And this is our index file. And a lot of the stuff in here is specific to Ionic to get it to work. But let's actually start copying over some of our code from the package repository that we created before. So let's copy over build. Let's pass build in here. Okay, build's right there. And then let's actually copy the parts of the index file over. So it's not as automatic as I would hope it to be, but okay. So we're going to copy over this stuff right here. We're going to put this in here. We're going to add a class of TTC body, and then instead of having this TTC view, so this might not work exactly as we want it to because there's already a combined version of Angular in here. So if this doesn't work, then I'm going to start copying over files directly. But you see how with Ionic, it defines its own HTML elements. And what happens is when the website renders with these HTML elements, it's going to show up as a native application would for an iPhone or an Android, right? So these are sort of pseudo tags in a way that get rendered accordingly when the application is run. So to get this to work, let's pass this right here. There's no guarantees this will work. I'm just experimenting. So, and let's keep this stuff right here. Let's remove that. And all right, okay. Let's actually copy all of this over right here. Go to the www folder. Let's remove the build folder. Let's copy all of this. Okay, so we have that copied over. And we're not going to need to use Angular UI router and not animate and that. Hopefully that does the job. And now if we go into the actual Ionic app, this is sort of loading that. We can just pass in here our application, which is called TTC app. And we can delete the standard configuration, like the default stuff that it had in there. So hopefully this works. Back to the index file. So now, one last thing. I need to pass in the actual address right here, which is TTC app. Oops. I always end up in one of these moments where I'm live coding and then I go too far, but I can't quit. So I have to keep going. So almost ready. So now if I run the command in the Ionic website, I type in Ionic platform add iOS. So we're going to add iOS support to this. And I have all the dependency installed, so it doesn't have to download anything. So that's there. And now we type in build iOS. That's doing that in the background. Build succeeded, that's good. And now it's going to run this. And it's going to launch an iPhone, or I guess an iPad. And hopefully, is it working? Still doing it. Okay, there we go. So our application, kind of, we have Shepherd and Blora right here. And, now we want to use our current location. Yes. No, it's still loading. Almost there. So if anyone's interested, now you know the basics of how to hook up Ionic with a web application. Okay. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
What would be the best resource to sort of get ramped up on this? Like, what would you recommend?
So there's a website called egghead.io, and these guys have really good bite-sized videos, like 10 minutes long videos, about each Angular component, in, each Angular area in particular. And then there's a newsletter called NG Newsletter, and here they have a really good Angular article to get started from scratch. And then as you get better and you start learning things, if you go to Angular's homepage, here there's videos from the conference. And then, then there's, if you want to learn about animations and testing, you can visit my website for Year of Moo, where you can find out new things about animation testing. And on Friday, I had a new article about a new feature about messaging and form elements. So there's a lot of areas, but Egghead, NG Newsletter, and then the Angular homepage, and then Year of Moo, which I think I can flip through these guys. No. Oh, if I refresh now, you can see that this guy right here. I got this shirt yesterday, so I'm very happy with that. All right, next, any other questions? Yes.
What does Ionic give you that you couldn't do without it?
So
I've experimented with Cordova and PhoneGap, so I know you can just copy the www directory and get it into a mobile app that way, so I'm not sure what Ionic, I haven't used Ionic yet.
So with Ionic, aside from just displaying a somewhat functioning website, I'm not really sure about the comparisons between them. I kind of just chose Ionic as a sort of testing ground for today. From what I understand, it's better sort of targeted towards an Angular application. You see that it actually uses Angular for itself, right? It uses Angular to render the routing for the page. So if you already have an Angular app, it's very simple to add it into the Ionic framework. Any other questions? Yes?
I read a little bit about your blog about SEO and how you put Angular together with that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, just because I know I put together my Angular application and the SEO part was always just like a disaster for me. So just any tips or tricks that you can share?
Sure. So the question was about SEO in an Angular app. All right, so if we go to our application right here, do you see this right here, this hash symbol and the exclamation mark? Aside from allowing us to have dynamic URLs on the page, does anyone actually know what that means? Like, why can't we just get rid of the exclamation mark and just have a hash symbol? What that means is when Google sees that or Bing sees that, it's like, oh, this is a JavaScript application. That means I can't render the HTML as a normal website would. And it goes to a special URL. It actually goes to escaped fragment. So let me type it in here. So go to websites.com/ no, what are you doing? Okay, so website escaped fragment equals the actual path. So that path is the actual address that is beyond the exclamation mark point. And it's up to your web server to display the natural HTML for this, the non-JavaScript enhanced HTML. So what the browser is actually rendering in its DOM. And with the article I explained, you can use Phantom.js to render this HTML for you and then save that file on your own. There are other services that do this. There's a service called Brombone, and there's a full backend solution called pre-render.io, which has a Rails driver, and I think it has other ones as well, which will just about do this for you 100% without having to write any code. So the SEO thing right now, it's kind of like a patch to get that to work. It's that might go away in a few years, as search engines know how to get around all the JavaScript stuff. Like JavaScript could potentially render something for a web server, not render it for a browser, but then Chrome, on the other hand, might be able to detect to see if that's happening. But hopefully this goes away in the future. But for now, this is what needs to happen. And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking that, yeah, Angular's great. These MVC frameworks are great, but my HTML is going to get ruined. My business won't run on a search engine anymore. Like, there's no guarantee that this will, be 100% the same as like a website that doesn't use an MVC framework, doesn't really render the page with JavaScript. But you saw how quickly you built a website using this technology. This is the way to go. You don't want to get held back by certain ways of working against search engines. And once again, most of these are going to be applications that are not, like a back-end thing or whatever, right? Anyways, what I'm saying is that use the new technologies that are available to you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, everybody.